Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to today's discussion. My name is Dino Pati Jalal, founder and chairman of Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, the largest foreign policy group in Indonesia and in Southeast Asia. You know, this month has been, there's a lot going on this month, but one big international development is Afghanistan. I think the political developments there has caught many of us by surprise. Kabul has fallen to the Taliban much sooner than people expected. And the US forces and allied forces have withdrawn from Afghanistan, and a lot of questions about what this means for the political future of Afghanistan, for South Asia. Even Southeast Asians are asking, what does this mean to our region? So there are a lot of questions unanswered and still remains to be seen. And we are very fortunate today to have Rory Stewart, who will share with us his understanding of events in Afghanistan. You know, Rory is a British person and one of the most interesting people that I have ever met. You know, he was a diplomat. He quit diplomacy and he walked 6,000 miles from, I think, Turkey to India, Nepal, Pakistan, and then Afghanistan at the height of the war. You know, yes, walk, yeah, not take the bus, not take motorcycle. He walked for, I think, about 3 years or so. And then he moved to Afghanistan afterwards. He started the Turqua Foundation there. He taught at Harvard University at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. He became a minister for international development in the British government. He wrote a book, best-selling book, which is called Places in Between. A wonderful book, I've read it. And he also taught at Yale University, and he also ran for the office of Prime Minister and lost to Prime Minister Boris Johnson now. You know, overall, it's a really one in a million guy, Rory. It's really, really nice to see you, and thanks for sharing your time with us, with friends in Indonesia. How are you, Rory?
Well, it's a great pleasure, and it's wonderful. And Dino and I have been friends for a very long time. I started my career as the second secretary of the British Embassy in Jakarta, so it's wonderful to come back again. I'm just feeling guilty about the fact that after 25 years of dealing with Afghanistan and Iraq, and that I'm so out of touch with Indonesia. But it's wonderful to reconnect with you and to see you running such a wonderful organization.
Yes, thank you. And sorry, I forget to mention that you were in Iraq, deputy governor at a province there, and then you were awarded the British Order Empire medal. Sorry if I messed it up.
Got the medals. Got the medals.
Yeah.
Not as many medals as you, Dino.
No. Well, but I think I need to ask you this, Rory. You walked 6,000 miles for 3 years, avoided cars and bikes and motorcycles and buses in the most dangerous place in the world at the time, which included Afghanistan. You know, so seriously, why did you do that? You know, people said, "Are you mad?" Yeah.
Well, I think the answer, Dino, is that I feel very strongly, and you must have felt this as a diplomat yourself, that you can often get stuck inside embassy compounds, living in a city, and that if you really want to understand countries, particularly a country like Afghanistan, you have to get into the rural areas. When I entered Afghanistan at the end of 2001, there were only about 300,000 people living in the capital city. And it was a country of 20,000 villages. And to really understand its life and its future, it was incredibly important to spend time in village houses. I remember at the end of the walk, so I just walked, I was walking for nearly 2 years, and I finally did the final 600 miles across Afghanistan. And I'd been staying every night in a different village house. I think I stayed in 500 village houses on the way. And I got to Kabul and I returned to a diplomatic meeting with President Karzai, with Ashraf Ghani, who was then the central bank governor, with Kofi Annan. And there was this document that we were all passed around saying every Afghan believes in a gender-sensitive, multi-ethnic, centralized state based on democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And I could see so clearly that this language made no sense to any village in which I'd stayed. I couldn't even think in Dari how I would translate that into language that somebody could understand. And I think from that realization about the surreal gap between the way that the international community speaks and the reality on the ground, many of the problems in Iraq, Afghanistan, but also many of the problems around the world in international development come out of that. And maybe that's something we can explore a bit more. But certainly that's one of the things that walking did for me.
Yeah, well, I saw one of your tweets recently where you were responding to a comment by US White House spokesperson. And she said that the Taliban, it's for the Taliban to determine what kind of role they want in the world. And you said that was somewhat naive. Yeah. Can you elaborate why?
President Biden has just done the most terrible thing. I mean, he's basically broken Afghanistan almost overnight. Afghanistan was still a very fragile, poor country, but it was much better at the beginning of this year than it was 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so it's been an extraordinary transformation. I mean, I said when I first saw Kabul, there were only 300, 400,000 people in the city. It's now a city of 4 or 5 million people. And many, many Afghans in Kabul and in the cities were beginning to live the kinds of middle-class lives that people live in Indonesia. Mobile phone use went from 0 to 90%. Everyone was on Facebook. Many, many more people going to universities springing up, schools springing up, a middle class springing up, businesses springing up. It really was a huge transformation. So then he broke it. He broke it basically because very recklessly and apparently not caring at all about the interests of the Afghan people, the air support and the command and control was removed almost overnight. And the Afghan army, of course, collapsed. We can talk a little bit more about why that happened. But it then seemed to me particularly cruel to then watch diplomats, and it's not just in the US, it's in the UK and elsewhere, making these very vague statements about how we now call on the Taliban to respect women's rights, and we will make sure as the international community, we hold them to their commitments. Of course, this is all completely empty language. I mean, how exactly is anybody supposed to hold them to their commitments if we've just handed the whole country to them? So I think it really, this question of language is very important. And it goes through the whole process. If we had been better over the last 20 or 30 years about being more realistic, showing more humility when we talk about other people's countries, for example, by saying things like, we hope over 20 years to make Afghanistan a little bit more prosperous, a little bit more stable, a little bit more humane than it was 20 years ago. We want Afghanistan over 20 years to look a bit more like Pakistan, a little bit less like the Congo. These are realistic things to say. But of course, nobody says that. They try to pretend they can turn it into Switzerland. They try to pretend they're going to be able to create this sort of dream state. And this language, I think, is very dangerous.
Yeah. From what you said, are you saying that some degree of nation building in Afghanistan was actually working? Because certainly Biden was saying that he's not interested in that aspect of Afghanistan. But is that what seems to be happening, that some nation building is actually happening?
Yeah, of course, there had been huge advances over 20 years. I mean, it was still a very fragile, poor country, but it was starting from an incredibly low base. And these things take a very long time. This is why the US and its allies should show strategic patience. So let's take South Korea. One of the problems with President Biden's analysis is he believes that we have to leave. We can't stay. How long are we going to stay? The truth is, of course, that the United States is still in South Korea 70 years after they initially went there. They're still keeping 25,000 soldiers in South Korea. There were only 2,500 soldiers, American soldiers in Afghanistan at the beginning of this year. So 10 times as many in South Korea. And not just for 20 years, for 70 years. Now, what does that mean? 20 years after the US first got involved in South Korea, so in the mid-1960s, the GDP per capita of South Korea was lower than the Congo. It's a very, very poor country still. And it was a military dictatorship. But the US did not say after 20 years, okay, this is all a waste of time, we're leaving. but they stayed. Now, of course, 70 years later, South Korea is one of the richest countries on earth. But it still would be dangerous to take US troops out. I mean, nobody thinks it's a smart idea to suddenly take 25,000 American troops out of South Korea. Now, President Biden's logic would suggest, well, look, if the South Korean state can't survive without US troops, the whole thing's a waste of time. It's not sustainable. How long are we going to stay? We're going to leave, right? But if you are able, as we were in Afghanistan, to keep some degree of peace and stability with 0 British casualties since 2014, no American soldiers killed since February 2020, and even before that, very, very few since 2014. This was a light, affordable presence, which was doing an enormous amount of good. And it's very, very strange that the politics of the world makes people feel we have to leave, when in fact it was costing surprisingly little for the international community to stay.
Yeah. Do you think there is a contradiction? On the one hand, the American and Western foreign policy calls on the emphasis on values, freedom, democracy, human rights. But in Afghanistan, they're undertaking a strategic pullback that would lead, in the eyes of many, to the downturn of these values in Afghanistan: freedom, human rights, and democracy. Yeah.
Yes, and of course it's very sad, because in a sense, from a humanitarian point of view, from a peacekeeping point of view, those troops were as important as UN peacekeepers in many, many parts of Africa. Right? Mm-hmm. And we support that normally. We support the idea that there should be some presence in DRC and Somalia, South Sudan, to prevent things getting worse. It's not necessary that it's going to make things better, but at least to prevent things getting worse. And since the end of the Cold War, the US and its allies have tried to say that they have a vision of a better world, that they do believe in human rights, that they do believe in democracy, they do believe particularly in Afghanistan, and trying to give opportunities to women. And we were protecting that and defending that. By leaving, it seems as though the US and its allies are saying, we don't really care about those things. We don't care enough to lose even one soldier trying to protect these things. We don't care that we've spent $1 trillion over 20 years. It reminds me, unfortunately, a little bit of, I have a 4-year-old, and he will start trying to build a piece of Lego, but if it's not perfect for him, he smashes it on the ground, runs out of the room and says, forget it. And I fear this is happening to the West. They had a dream that they could turn Afghanistan into a perfect state. They got frustrated because, of course, it's not perfect. It was slow. It was getting better, but very slowly. And rather than stick with it and keep trying, they just smash the whole thing on the ground and walk away.
Yeah. Well, Rory, I saw your TED Talk 10 years ago, a very impressive talk where you argued that no amount of military presence or military offensive in Afghanistan can pacify that country, right? And I think you call for an end to the Afghan war, right? So when you see things that are happening today, what do you feel? I mean, do you feel that you're vindicated in saying those things? Was it a big surprise? And what is your comment on?
Well, I suppose I think there have been 2 big mistakes in Afghanistan. One is the big surge, which went from 2005 to 2011, which was when, so Afghanistan, after the initial intervention after September 11th, was a very light presence. There were very few American and British troops from 2001 to 2004-05. The Afghan government was leading, we were providing some support. And that was a good situation, a light, sustainable footprint. We then made a mistake in 2005-06, from my point of view, which was to turn it into a military occupation, bring in ultimately 130,000 soldiers, spend $100 billion a year, and try to nation build under fire. And it was an impossible idea. And by doing so, I think it ruined a lot of things, because it allowed the Taliban to say, not this is a light United Nations mission, which is what it felt like in the early days, but instead say, we are fighting for Islam in Afghanistan against a foreign military occupation. And of course, a lot of people got killed, and that's. In 2014, combat operations ended. And I think that was the right thing. And for the last 7 years, our presence in Afghanistan has returned to something like the early stage, very light, very few troops, providing a bit of command and control and support to the Afghan military. That was the correct position because it meant the Afghan government was in the lead. It meant that foreign troops were not out in the villages. And that was a sustainable position because it was a position that was not costing US or British lives, right, recently. And that means that, in fact, very few since 2014, which meant we could have kept it going with our voters. So there have been two big mistakes, in other words. One was the huge military investment, which went in from 2005 to 2014, that sort of 9-year period. And then the second, that did a lot of damage. But the fatal error is this decision to withdraw the last few.
Yeah. You know, Rory, we in Indonesia, we had a conflict in Aceh. And at some point we realized that military solutions will never resolve the issue. And in the end, Aceh became peaceful because we opted for peaceful political settlement in the form of strategic autonomy. In Afghanistan, do you think that they should have offered power sharing arrangement to the Taliban long ago, or it was never should be an option? Yeah.
No, I think you're right. In an ideal world, you would have a power sharing arrangement, but you need to do it with confidence because otherwise the Taliban will not negotiate. I mean, remember the situation that we have in Afghanistan is a little different from Aceh because it would be like the Indonesian government saying, we're setting a deadline, we're going to leave Aceh completely in a few months' time. And now we'd like to negotiate with you. Of course, the other side would just refuse to negotiate. What's the point of negotiating when you're saying you're leaving? So you just wait them out. There's this great cliche that the Taliban have where they say, you have the watches, we have the time. So if you're serious about this type of negotiation, you need to make the other side feel that you are invested and that there is a reason for them to arrive at a ceasefire and a compromise. If they think you're just going to hand the entire country to them anyway, if they just wait long enough, why would they agree to a power sharing arrangement if they think they can just have the whole place? So the problem from the American negotiation from the beginning is they made it so clear to the Taliban that their number one priority was to get out. And as soon as they made that clear, the negotiation was meaningless.
Yeah. Rory, you spent 3 years in Afghanistan with your foundation, and I'm sure you met with some Taliban commanders during your walk as well, and so on. Yeah. Tell us your impressions on the Taliban, politically, militarily.
So, I mean, obviously, one thing to remember is that the Taliban that I saw 20 years ago is very, very different from the Taliban today. And one of the reasons for that is that the Taliban, the median age in Afghanistan is 18. So over 20 years, the majority of or under the median age of people have not ever experienced the Taliban. And the Taliban fighters are people who were not born in 9/11, many of them. So there are a few old commanders in Doha, but basically this is an organization of new people. What does that mean? We don't know yet. The Taliban leadership have become much more focused on public relations, on reaching out. So they're doing things that the old Taliban would never have done. They're making statements about the fact that they say they're going to respect women's education. They've made statements saying they're going to respect ethnic minorities. Obviously, the Taliban are Sunni, but they allowed a big Shia procession to happen last week. They would never have done that 20 years ago. 20 years ago, they were going after the Hazara community in central Afghanistan, which is Shia, in an almost genocidal attempt to kill people. I walked through villages which were totally empty. Everybody had gone, the whole village was burnt. What we don't know is how long that will remain the case, because they are, of course, a jihadi group with very strong links to jihadi financing. They, of course, have close connections to Al-Qaeda, still do. They've just put the Haqqani network in charge of security in Kabul. So there's a paradox here. Obviously, the Taliban cannot be completely in favor of the Western situation that was developing in Kabul. Otherwise, they wouldn't have spent 20 years trying to destroy it. And what were they fighting for, ultimately? If they really liked female news presenters and women going to university and what modern Afghanistan looked like, they wouldn't have spent 20 years trying to destroy it. So I think I would like to feel, and you must feel as a diplomat, that we should try to negotiate with them, try to reach out to them, try to take them at their word and say, look, that's great. I mean, if you want to have a more moderate version and you stick to that, we'll work with you. But there is every reason to be a little bit doubtful about whether this can continue. And of course, what's likely to happen is that sanctions will be imposed, tensions will develop with the US and NATO, Taliban will become more paranoid, resistance movements will start in Afghanistan, they will have to start clamping down on people who are opposing them, and then you will see over a number of months, I'm afraid, that things will probably become more restrictive.
Yeah. Do you sense there is a feeling of not wanting to be engaged on Afghanistan anymore among the Western countries? Just like what the United States did in Vietnam. They left Vietnam, and for many years they just didn't want to do anything with Vietnam. They just became allergic to it. They turned their backs on any issues relating to Vietnam for some years until they changed some years ago. Yeah, but is this what America and allied nations are going to be towards Afghanistan? Having this no more to do with.
It's so difficult to know. That certainly seems to be President Biden's view, and President Biden seems to be. It's something in his personality that I didn't realize until recently. I was quite, I was quite in favor of him becoming president. But there's part of him that genuinely, as you say, seems to want to say, I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to have anything to do with it. He's just sort of closing his ears. Now, there is a different side of the United States, which is many, many very, very smart diplomats, generals, academics, analysts who've devoted 20 years of their life to understanding Afghanistan and the importance of Afghanistan. And they represent a very powerful constituency who will try to keep arguing that this is a place of some strategic significance, that the United States has a moral obligation towards it. And it will be about the balance between that group, which is a foreign policy establishment, and the normal American voter, many of whom will be attracted by President Biden's view, which is essentially, I think, forget about this country. It was always hopeless. We achieved nothing. It's a dead loss. Let's leave it to the Taliban.
What foreign powers outside the Western countries you think have strong influence on the Taliban? Yeah.
Well, the first country, of course, which has very strong links is Pakistan. So the Pakistan Inter-Services Intelligence Agency has been deeply involved in the Taliban since its creation. They helped to create the Taliban in the early 1990s, and they remain very closely connected to it. Now, of course, there are splits within Pakistan. So some parts of the Pakistani government sometimes talk as though they can see that the Taliban are a risk to them. And indeed, the Taliban were a risk to them. There was a moment 12 years ago where the Taliban were within about 100 miles of Islamabad, the Pakistani Taliban. But fundamentally, Pakistan has provided the possibility for the Taliban to flourish because they've allowed them to have safe haven. They've allowed the Taliban leadership to have houses and their families in Quetta. They've allowed Pakistani and Afghan Taliban fighters to cross and recross the borders, and much more than that. If you go back to the mid-90s, there were quite literally Pakistani special forces and soldiers alongside the Taliban when they advanced on Kabul. So Pakistan. Now, the problem, of course, is that the influence that you have over somebody when they take power is often less than you hope. So it's they will listen to you when they're a guerrilla force and they need your money, they need your support, they need your advice. When they've taken control of the whole government, it's surprising how often they will then turn around and say, yeah, we don't care anymore. We're not interested in hearing your views. So I think the Pakistan Inter-Services Intelligence Agency is now going to find itself in a very uncomfortable position where they will discover that their control and influence over the Taliban is less than they expected. Other countries will come in. Iran.
But Qatar,
Yeah, well, Qatar has influence because they helped organize the Doha negotiations and have strong links in and have a good relationship with them at the moment. We shall see what sort of relationship Turkey develops. Turkey is still on the ground. We certainly have the Iranians very focused on trying to protect the Shia minorities, which are a few million people in central Afghanistan. I think it's very possible that Russia and China, if the West totally withdraws, if we impose sanctions, say we're not going to provide any financial assistance to the Afghan government, may step into that gap and provide some of the development financing to keep the country going, and possibly some more technical advice and support too. So essentially, the naivety, I think, of the US, UK, NATO approach is that sometimes when President Biden or Prime Minister Boris Johnson speak, they sound as though they're saying, we're leaving Afghanistan to leave it to the Afghans to sort themselves out. But the truth is, what they actually are doing is leaving it to other countries to get involved and interfere. The Afghans themselves are usually the victims of their neighbors. It's a small, poor, fragile country. And in the end, most of Afghanistan's history is about tensions with Russia and Britain, with the United States and Russia, with Pakistan, Iran, and now perhaps with China.
Yeah. Do you think China is worried about Afghanistan under Taliban, or do they see strategic opportunity?
I think they must be concerned in one sense. I mean, they're obviously concerned about Xinjiang and the Uyghur population of Xinjiang. And so there's a potential tension there. Equally, they have very large copper mines and investments in Afghanistan. They put $3.5 billion into the Messainak copper mine, which they will want to keep operating and running. They are enjoying at the moment the humiliation of the United States. If you read the Chinese newspapers at the moment, they are really rubbing their hands at what they see as an amazing exposure of the weakness of the United States. They will begin to suggest that this will suggest that the US will not support Taiwan and other places too. And I think China and Russia will both be interested in the possibility of demonstrating that they can have an influential role in Afghanistan when the US, the UK, and others failed.
Rory, when you were in Afghanistan, what do they think about organizations like Organization of Islamic States, Organization of Islamic Conference, OIC, yeah, of which Indonesia is a member? Is that an organization that can potentially help play a role in engaging the Taliban and making sure that, yeah.
I mean, I think it could, you know, the question will depend on personal relationships, because of course the Taliban remains very suspicious. I mean, it's been a resistance group for 20 years. And if you look back to the period in just before they blew up the Buddhas in Bamiyan, this moment in beginning of 2001 when they destroyed those Buddhas, a lot of Islamic countries reached out to them. The Sheikh al-Azhar from Cairo tried to speak to them. Prince Hassan bin Talal from Jordan tried to reach out to them. And they were not interested really in speaking. So, I mean, I think there's a possibility, but it would take a lot of very patient diplomacy to win the trust of the Taliban, because there are many elements in the Taliban that believe that other Muslim countries are actually traitors. They cooperate too much with the West.
Yeah. You know, Rory, the most lucrative assets that owned by the Taliban is the opium, right? How do you think this would affect Afghans' international relations under the Taliban? You know, this opium factor. Obviously, not many countries are comfortable with this, right?
Yeah, no countries are comfortable with this, but we have to be honest that over the last 20 years, Afghanistan has been a major opium producer. So I think it will be a problem for the Taliban, and probably the West, which can be a little bit hypocritical, will probably complain more about the opium production from Afghanistan under the Taliban than they have over the last 20 years. But the reality is the opium production may go down under the Taliban. I mean, the Taliban actually stopped opium production and almost bankrupted themselves in 2000. A lot of the opium production was warlords associated with the Afghan government.
Okay. Let's take a couple of questions from the audience. By the way, we have hundreds of Indonesians that are tuning in, and thank you for tuning in. Let me take one question. This is actually from Romania, the Romanian Diplomatic Institute. What can we expect from the UK policy-wise for Afghanistan?
Well, the it's all to play for. I think there are two things that the UK should be doing, and it would be wonderful to work with Romania and other countries to do. And they're largely focused on the humanitarian situation, on the refugee situation. So the first thing is we should be continuing humanitarian and development assistance to people inside Afghanistan. If we don't, there will be an enormous pressure of refugees and people trying to leave the country. So that means not imposing sanctions. That means continuing to produce funding for charities and UN agencies. It means getting the banking system going again. It's almost impossible to transfer money to anyone in Afghanistan at the moment. And it's actually within 5 days of running out of all its money. Its water supply, electricity systems are going to collapse. The engineers aren't there, the consultants aren't there to support all of this. So the first thing is providing humanitarian development assistance and doing so in a smart way, which doesn't get presented as supporting the Taliban government, but is about supporting the Afghan people. The second thing is coming up with a proper humanitarian compact on refugees and sharing the burden across the world. That doesn't mean the United Kingdom or Romania taking the full burden for themselves. It means a genuinely equitable share where we have a pledging conference and we all undertake to take a certain number. I'd like to see people aim to take, let's say, 0.05% of their population every year. Canada has done a fantastic lead, as always. Canadians are extraordinary on this, have already announced they'll take 25,000 people. The British have announced 20,000, but it's only 5,000 a year for 4 years. They could take many, many more. There have been incredibly generous offers from North Macedonia, Albania, Kosovo, Serbia have all stepped forward to say that they will take some refugees. Iraq has also offered. If countries like that can offer, certainly France, Germany, Britain, the US, Australia could be taking far more. And the model, of course, is the Vietnamese boat people in the late 1970s, where eventually the world got together and came up with a compact for 2.5 million people.
Oh, okay. We have a question from Ade May Rizal. Do you expect Afghanistan to be the victim of a new geopolitical game?
Yes, very much. I mean, it will be a fragile state. It'll be a vacuum. Many other countries, Pakistan, Iran, China, Russia, will be tempted to get involved. There's a high possibility that terrorist groups will try to approach the Taliban and base themselves there. It's certainly providing inspiration to jihadi groups around the world. So it's, yeah, I think it's going to be the center for a new major geopolitical problem. And yet again, entirely unnecessarily.
Okay. By the way, anyone who wants to ask questions, just send some of your questions to the chat. Yeah. Indra Wisnu Wibisono asks, sooner or later, the United States will finish Afghan war, and it has been proven. But the question is, why now? What happened with the United States? Why they choose to end it now and in a hurry with that manner when they left? Even US allies are starting to question America's decision for damaging their image. So
I agree. It was a very, very difficult, inexplicable decision to understand. I think from President Biden's point of view, so let's try to understand what he was thinking. President Biden was deeply influenced by Vietnam, and he was very angry that in 2009, he was not able to prevent President Obama from sending more troops to Afghanistan to stop the surge. So I think he wasn't really looking at Afghanistan, the reality of Afghanistan. The reality of Afghanistan at the beginning of this year, as I said, was only 2,500 American soldiers compared to 25,000 in South Korea. And it was a situation where no American soldiers had been killed since February 2020, and only, I think, about 60 since 2014, right? So, but he didn't see that. President Biden, instead of seeing the reality of this very, very light, relatively cost-free US presence, which was almost infinitely sustainable, convinced himself that he was in the middle of a bloody civil war, that thousands of American lives were being lost, that he was still stuck in the forever wars of 2009. It's as though he couldn't adjust to the new situation, or maybe even in his mind, he's still stuck in Vietnam. So he wanted to be the president who brought our boys home. And to justify this, he tried to say that President Trump had begun a peace negotiation with the Taliban at the beginning of 2020. And in that negotiation, President Trump had said he was going to remove troops. So Biden's argument is, okay, we said we were going to remove troops. We couldn't leave the troops there because we told the Taliban we were going to remove the troops. It's a so that's his view. It's a crazy view, of course, because that agreement with the Taliban was the US would leave its troops if the Taliban agreed to a ceasefire and to come to a government where they would have a compromise with the Afghan government and they would not take any district capitals and this, that, and the other. So obviously the Taliban didn't follow through on what their side of the deal was supposed to be, in which case the removal of US troops was crazy. He's also suggesting that if we had tried to leave the troops there, then in the future, we would have been drawn into a horrible war. Well, who knows? But there's definitely no evidence of that at all. As I say, I mean, the US British troops were not under any pressure at all. They hadn't lost a single casualty in a year and a half. So this idea that somehow if we'd stayed, we would we would suddenly find ourselves facing casualties, very difficult to believe. The US-UK presence was in big bases, and it was basically just providing support. There were liaison officers sitting alongside Afghan air controllers, providing some support with drones and planes. There was no way that the Taliban was going to be able to get to them. And in fact, the Taliban didn't really have a conventional military option. They simply couldn't roll tanks and artillery up to these towns, because if they did, they'd be hit from the air. So fast forward, what did the US do in this withdrawal? What they did is they basically dismantled the linchpin of the Afghan military. So the Afghan military had been built with a very, very expensive US wraparound. Instead of allowing the Afghan army to continue to buy relatively straightforward Russian military equipment, which they were used to and which they'd had for 40 years, they encouraged the Afghan Air Force to buy Black Hawk helicopters, these very, very expensive high technology American helicopters. And those helicopters and the other planes and the other assets on the ground required 18,000 American civilian contractors on the ground in Afghanistan to run them. They did all the maintenance, they did all the IT software updates, they actually loaded the munitions onto them. Right? These were pieces of equipment that after every mission needed to do a full, incredibly complicated, highly technical software update. They also had systems that were incredibly high-tech in terms of surveilling from the air, which required US air controllers sitting alongside Afghan air controllers. These things were essential because if you are an Afghan fighting in an outpost in the middle of some crazy part of Uruzgan or, I don't know, Helmand, you need the close air support because that's where your ammunition supplies comes from, that's where your food comes from, that's where your medical evacuation comes from. And the United States removed that overnight. They didn't just remove their own planes and their own air controllers, they removed the 18,000 civilian contractors who maintained the Afghan Air Force. So suddenly these Afghans were out there in these lonely positions with no close air support, no medevac, no food. Many of them hadn't been paid for some time. But most fundamentally, it was the morale blow. The Americans left like thieves in the night. They left Bagram Air Base without even telling the Afghan commander they were leaving. He just woke up in the morning, they weren't there anymore. So it's genuinely the morale. We've been totally betrayed. We've been totally left. And then people thought, okay, I'm not going to do a suicidal fight against the Taliban when nobody has my back. Nobody's coming to get me. Right? I'm out here in this outpost. There's no helicopters coming. There's no air support. We're all going to be murdered. So not surprisingly, in the end, people decided that however much they hate the Taliban, it was preferable to a suicidal and hopeless fight, village after they'd been betrayed.
You know, Rory, now there is a government in Afghanistan, in Kabul at least, and there have been some pledges of allegiance by some ethnic groups and so on towards the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan under the Taliban. Yeah. How sustainable is this coalition? Is this new political setup in Kabul?
Very difficult to know. I mean, the fact is the Taliban are a very small organization, very, very thinly spread. They took the country much more quickly than they could ever have imagined. They were only able to do so by releasing prisoners from jail and using prisoners to help them take these towns. They have no experience in governing or running anything. Most of the middle-class civil servants are not coming to work. It's going to be very difficult. When I walked across Afghanistan end of 2001, after 5 years of Taliban government, there was basically no government services. There were no schools in rural areas, really. There were very few clinics. There were very few roads. There was no, I mean, and when you went to see the Taliban in their office, they were guys kind of sitting around having cups of tea, but the offices were largely empty. I mean, nothing was happening. There was no money to run the state. So it's very difficult to know whether they're going to be able to run a state at all. And Afghanistan and military control in Afghanistan is so fragile because the Taliban have just, in 1995, they did what they've just done now. They took the whole country in a matter of weeks, with almost no fighting. People just laid down their arms and they bought their way from time to time. But after 9/11, the end of 2001, they lost the country in about 2 weeks as well. Because as soon as a little bit of pressure from the Northern Alliance, backed by very, very few Americans, came on them, the Taliban government just vanished. So this is a country where, in the end, the state structures are not very strong. It's really can often revert to being 20,000 independent villages. And the state hasn't penetrated very deeply into these areas. So the Taliban government will be a very fragile government. And it's still very ethnically connected with the Pashtun group in southern Afghanistan, southern and eastern Afghanistan. It doesn't have strong support from the Hazara, from the Tajik, from the Uzbek.
Yeah. Rory, some of the Taliban leaders have said that, yeah, we'll forgive everybody as long as we live in Sharia law Islamic State, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, there are quite a few Islamic states around the world that also implements Sharia law.
No.
And they have some degree of freedom, modernity,
Sure.
and economic growth. Yeah.
Sure.
Is it realistic to say that the Afghan under the Taliban will head one way, one form or another in that direction?
It's very difficult to know. We don't know. And I think, in a sense, the Indonesian audience here in this conversation has a better sense than people do in Britain or the United States about the costs, benefits, and risks of this. Of course, it's true that there are examples of Muslim governments around the world implementing Sharia who are running states which have economic growth, which have state stability, and which are delivering many things for their citizens. Of course, that's true. We can think of many examples. But the Taliban is quite far out. I mean, it's quite an extreme group. This is not a, remember, even under the last government they were fighting against, it was a Muslim country, which actually implemented a lot of elements of traditional Muslim social codes. So under President Karzai, for example, a judge found that somebody who had converted from Islam should be sentenced to death. So this was not a very, Afghanistan was not Dubai, right? It was not a very kind of trendy, super fashionable place, right? It was a place where Afghans are still quite conservative. I mean, even under the last government, President Ghani's government, women covered their heads, people were modestly dressed. This was not a sort of crazy party capital, not like, so it wasn't like Egypt or Lebanon, right? So we don't know what the Taliban are going to do, but my guess is that it will probably be a government which will be more conservative than the Muslim government, Brotherhood government that emerged in Egypt under Morsi. It will probably have less technical and technocratic skills. And it has a slightly paranoid relationship to the outside world. So it would take a real Nelson Mandela-like figure amongst the Taliban to really turn that around and actually embrace it. And I think it's unlikely.
Yes. Yeah. I don't see any such figure around from what I see. We have a question from Dani Putra Pratama from Tsukuba University. Mr. Rory, related to the pro-government warlords, do you think that another wave of civil war is possible within Afghanistan in the future? If so, is there any chance that the Taliban would demand foreign fighters to join the cause, such as ISIS did back in the early 2010s? Anyways, I'm enjoying this session very much. Thank you, Pat Rory. Yeah. Go ahead.
So I think that's a very good question, really good question. At the moment, the Taliban control about 90% of Afghanistan, in theory. I mean, control is a very uncertain word in Afghanistan. But the Panjshir Valley, which is the Tajik Panjshiri stronghold, is currently controlled by the former government. So Amrullah Saleh, who was the been various different roles, defense minister, interior minister, vice president, is now calls himself the president of Afghanistan. And the son of Ahmad Shah Massoud, who fought against the Taliban in the 1990s, is now claiming command. So there's a valley there, a big, big valley with a lot of people who are beginning to set up a resistance to the Taliban. There will be temptations on other warlords and regional players to swap sides. And this is a very difficult thing to assess what will happen. I think if it does happen, let's say some neighboring countries decided to start funding resistance against the Taliban, providing intelligence people money to the Panjshir Valley to try to fight the Taliban. There is a very strong possibility of civil war. And of course, that will make the Taliban even more paranoid and even more violent, because they will then be searching in Kabul and elsewhere for anybody that could be associated with this opposition to them. It will probably lead, I'm afraid, to many, many more deaths as different factions in Afghanistan try to fight back and forth. And to a fractured, unstable country. Almost the worst period in Afghanistan was not the Taliban period, it was the civil war period that preceded it from 91 to 95. When all these different groups were fighting. So it's a horrible choice, but one of the things that Western policymakers need to think about seriously is whether a Taliban government is not preferable to a civil war. That's a horrible thing to say, because as I've just said, there are so many things that are horrifying potentially about a Taliban government. But a civil war that dragged on for years might be even worse.
Okay, we have a question from Jaya Suparman from University of Muhammadiyah, Yogyakarta. What do you think Afghanistan has done wrong in the last 20 years in terms of building their power? It seems they have anything. Okay, I don't understand the next line of questions, but
state building, maybe. So maybe it's a question about state building, nation building in Afghanistan. I mean, I think the answer there is that creating a modern state is very, very, very difficult and takes a very long time, and it's very painful. And Indonesia is a good way of thinking about it. If you think about where Indonesia was in the late 1940s, early 1950s, trying to struggle to bring together so many diverse communities, languages, areas. In a sense, Afghanistan was in a similar state. And it was maybe in an even more difficult state than Indonesia, because it found itself in a particularly dangerous neighborhood where everybody was interfering, particularly the Cold War fight between the Soviet Union and the United States. I mean, I think that the thing that really broke Afghanistan, by the 1970s, Afghanistan was on a path which was reasonable, not completely different to the type of path. I apologize, somebody's tried to telephone. Not completely different to the type of path that, for example, I don't know, by the 1970s, Bangladesh might have been on, or even countries like Sri Lanka might have been on. So it's, I think the breaking point was the decision from the Soviet Union to invade, and then the US-backed resistance to Soviet Union that created essentially the next 40, 50 years of civil war. And so Afghanistan state building in that situation, when you have had no state for 20 years, when your entire population is armed, when only very few people can read and write, when you have, when I walked from Herat to Kabul, there was no electricity between Herat and Kabul. You're starting from an incredibly low base. And the sorts of problems that most developing countries have. I mean, remember, there are still insurgencies in India, there are still insurgencies in Nigeria, there's still insurgencies in Pakistan. Corruption is not just something that happens in Afghanistan. I mean, President Biden keeps saying the whole thing was a waste of time because of corruption. Now, come on, I mean, there's corruption, bad corruption in most countries in the world. And in the developing world, certainly, unbelievable corruption in almost every poor developing country. So the idea that Afghanistan was unique on that point of view is crazy, but it was a very, very difficult place to turn around. And the problem is not the Afghan people, the problem is conflict. Once conflict and violence starts, and you can see this in Syria, you can lose years of economic and political advancement very quickly.
You know, Rory, I've been talking to my friends from around Asia on Afghanistan, and there seems to be a prevailing mindset here. And the mindset is like this. Look, the Americans, with all their military might, couldn't stay. Yeah, and they have given up on nation building, right? So there's nothing, if Americans can't, with all their resources, can't do anything, neither can we. So the most realistic option now is just to make sure nothing that the Taliban does can disrupt regional order and stability, spill over to the outside the territory, their borders. But whatever happens inside, God willing, right? We just close our eyes, and but so long as it doesn't spill over to regional order. So is that the right perspective?
I think there's some wisdom in it, but probably
you could probably do a little bit more. So I think you're absolutely right that the most practical approach, and I think this is probably going to be China's approach, is to say, let's try to contain the situation and stop it spreading too far. But it's certainly worth other countries reaching out to try to see if there are links into the Taliban. It's certainly worth trying to provide humanitarian development assistance, because if Afghanistan collapses into civil war and horror, that will push refugees out of the country. It will create much more instability. It's much more likely to end up hosting terrorist groups. So I think the international community should try in the short term to see if it can do things to be generous and stabilize and support. But that's not nation building, of course, right? We shouldn't get involved in nation building. The idea now of trying to do anything like what the US has been doing for 20 years is, forget it, it's finished. But there are things that we can try to do to make the situation at least not get much worse. Don't get so pessimistic and cynical that we just think it's such a disaster, it can't get any worse. It can get much, much worse. And it's a tragic truth, but if Afghanistan descends into civil war, it's going to be 10 times worse than the situation we have now. So if there's anything that other countries can do to try to make it slightly more likely that things don't deteriorate further, it's worth doing.
Yeah. We have a question from Anton Alifandi. Mr. Rory, what is the likelihood of Afghanistan again becoming a training ground for Islamic militants as it did in the 1990s? Or they have learned their lessons? Yeah.
Very difficult to know. I mean, the Taliban keep saying they've learned their lesson, and we hope they have. And definitely, if terrorist training camps were set up again, the Taliban would be aware that they're likely to be hit very hard by the US. It's difficult to, and maybe the world of big terrorist training camps is a little different to what it was before 2001. However, it depends how isolated the Taliban becomes. It depends which faction in the Taliban takes over ideologically. At the moment, they are fighting the Islamic State in Afghanistan. One of their problems was they released all the prisoners from all these jails as they went down the country, and a lot of the people they've released have been Islamic State prisoners. So around Chaki, the Taliban were fighting the Islamic State a few days ago. So these Al-Qaeda Islamic State tensions are going to erupt. And there's still a significant Islamic State presence in Afghanistan. The question is, from the point of view, obviously, of the US interests, is this going to become an international terrorist threat, or is it a more regional threat?
Okay. Let's move out of Afghanistan and talk about fun stuff, Rory. You know, you and I have something in common, right? We're both diplomats, and at some point in our life, we left diplomacy and got into politics a little bit, right? I got into politics. I totally did not enjoy it, and I left politics after only about a year or so, right? Now I'm much happier being a professional and leading a nonprofit foreign policy group, right? But you went in politics big time. You became minister for international development, minister for prisons too, if I'm not mistaken. And you competed for the prime minister office against Boris Johnson and many others. So tell me, do you think that was the right decision, leaving diplomacy for politics, and was it worth the journey here?
It was punishing and painful, and I feel that 10 years of my life was some of the worst 10 years I've ever lived. I think probably the worst 10 years of my life. I find being a politician exhausting and very bad for your body and mind and soul. And I think contemporary politics in Britain and the United States is particularly bad. I mean, I think the fundamental problem is that what you have to do to get elected completely distorts your character and changes you as a human being and makes it much less easy for you to actually be good in government. So to be good in government, you need to think critically and clearly. But to be elected, you need to produce very, very strange, bogus confidence, optimism, nonsense. I mean, so the tension between the way that you end up speaking and thinking to get elected and the way you need to speak and think to run a country well is almost impossible at the moment in Western societies.
Yeah.
However, as a public servant, as somebody who cared about Britain and wanted to serve my country, and I'd been a soldier and a diplomat and this and the other, I couldn't really avoid becoming a politician because I felt that as a civil servant, I was taking the instructions from the politicians. I felt here were these people, for example, screwing up Afghanistan. And in order to really change it, I needed to be at the top. So, I became a foreign office minister. I then became Secretary of State for International Development. As you say, I was also an environment minister and prisons minister. All these things were fascinating for me. Fascinating, of course, for those of you on the phone who are civil servants to realize actually how little power politicians have, and actually how strange the relationship is between the two. The civil servants often feel frustrated and powerless, and the politicians also feel frustrated and powerless, and nobody really knows where the power lies.
There's no need to be an idealistic person, Rory. You're always talking about saving the world and things like that. Your experience in politics, did that temper your sense of idealism somehow, or it did not?
I think it certainly, it hasn't tempered my idealism, but it certainly made me much more depressed. I mean, it certainly has destroyed my confidence in my own ability to change the world. I mean, it's made me focus now on running a much smaller nonprofit now. We're moving to Jordan to work with Syrian refugees, Palestinians, Jordanians. And I like focusing on things which are quite small and tangible, where I feel I can make a difference to a few hundred lives, instead of pretending I can change the lives of millions.
Yeah, I totally agree, because that's what I'm doing now with my group. From just 12 people now, with the largest foreign policy group in Indonesia and Southeast Asia. And I feel that I'm my own boss, and whatever I have that I want to translate into the world, I can do it without asking anybody's permission, right? And that's amazing value for me in comparison with working with the government or as a politician. But surely, Rory, you're still young. Your kids are still 4 and 6, right? And are you going back to politics? The office of the Prime Minister is a very sexy title. I would love to visit London and stay over at 10 Downing Street if you're there, right? So is that a possibility?
Yeah. Well, I think we're coming to the very end, so it needs my last answer. But I think the answer is you would be very, very welcome. But I would need to get a lot more energy and confidence back before I tried that again. And thank you so much for having me. It was
Thank you. Rory, it's been amazing, and it's been a pleasure to be your friend. And I hope you will come visit Indonesia again one day. And please do what you do. It's really inspiring for me and all my staff to see you, and send my best to Shoshana and your 2 kids. Yeah. Thank you,
Thank
Rory.
you so much. Thank you, and much love to your family.
Terima
Bye-bye.
kasih. Yeah.
Terima kasih.
I got it. Is he on still?